Thanks for the opportunity. I'm very happy to be here to share some quick thoughts on our President Carter's comments, in particular about Hong Kong. I was a little bit surprised to see, a flood of comments and questions coming from Hong Kong, in particular on the ongoing protests. I mean, that's quite a relief to me, to see the whole world certainly has a lot of attentions on Hong Kong. Hong Kong shouldn't be a forgotten child after the handover back to 1997. So I think I intended to agree that Jimmy Carter's approach to sort of resolve the situation in Hong Kong. He mentioned probably the students should negotiate with the government for a more long-term solution, which is to how to get the 1,200 nominators to be democratic elected. That is a very good suggestion, but on the other side, I feel perhaps President Carter sort of underestimates the complexity of the situation. One thing we all know is Beijing just doesn't want to see any uncertainty in the situation in Hong Kong, even for the long run. So if you want Beijing to back down sort of to get the nominators to be elected for the long run, basically you open the door for the genius universal suffrage for the long run. I don't think that will be an option that Beijing will take. So he has a very good intention, a good suggestion, but I don't think it's very practical. The other thing is about mutual trust. I think he mentioned a couple of times, and I fully agree with. I think on both sides, people-to-people relations on both sides and government-to-government relations on both sides, certainly mutual trust is one of the very key problems that we don't see anyhow, a very realistic solution to solve it. It's quite interesting, he mentioned so many Chinese students nowadays, studying in the US, but we have to ask ourselves, why we still have such low mutual trust between the two countries. I mean, one of the questions from the audience, basically blame the media. To some extent, that may make some sense, but the cyber war and a lot of other things, even on the corporate level, sort of the struggles to steal commercial secrets. I mean, I agree with President Carter. A lot of things like that happen on equal basis. So it's not like a one-way solution. You have to get some two-way communications to work on that. Thanks.
Oh, sorry about that. I'll keep my remarks quite brief. I thought he did it. I mean, I hope I'm that lucid and engaging and funny at age 90. I think that he was really struck a very nice balance between striving to promote cooperation, but also recognizing that we, the United States and China, don't always see eye to eye on whether it's Taiwan or human rights. That expressing differences in a reasonable manner, but not necessarily getting up on a soapbox and declaiming the other's actions, particularly when that would be counterproductive, is sort of a wise, I think, course of action. And so I would just say that I think that particularly with the ongoing situation in Hong Kong, I think the Obama administration, by and large, has followed, I think, that type of a model of, sounding supportive, but not necessarily being pointedly so. And I think that that's been, to the extent that there can be a compromise and to give those in Beijing a sense of security rather than feeding into their insecurity and the sense of nationalism there. That's been helpful.
I think that what I was most struck by, of course, was Carter himself. I kept listening to this historical figure, 90 years old, the peer of Deng Xiaoping. So Deng Xiaoping has passed on, and Carter is still there. And I was listening very attentively to the way in which he retold that history. And then if I'm thinking forward, I kept going back in my mind the conditions that allowed Deng Xiaoping and Jimmy Carter in secret and then publicly to negotiate such important terms of this Taiwan relationship, and how, in my mind, such possibilities are impossible for Obama and Xi. So that was the kind of thing that was going through my head. I've always actually admired and respected Carter. People, when they said this was a disastrous administration and he couldn't do X, Y, and Z, I actually didn't believe it then, and I still don't believe it historically. If I put Carter in the context of the presidents of the last 50 years, to me, there's some very noteworthy achievements. And of course, if you're interested in China, you're particularly struck by what happened in U.S.-China relations. So I think that was really the issue that's playing in the back of my head, is that I feel the challenges before, even though he said, we never could have imagined the China today in 1978. The two of them could not have imagined how far the two countries have gone and how our societies, economies are so interpenetrated. But I was also thinking, in a way, perhaps it was easier for the president-to-president kind of diplomacy than we have today.
So I had a similar sense listening, in part because what I really appreciated about President Carter's remarks was the sort of broad historical perspective, not just him speaking about his work over the past 40 years, but also putting developments in China in perspective. And often in this world dominated by 24-hour news media and a quick turnaround and messages that have to be condensed down to Twitter, we're looking for the immediate change, and when we don't see it, we think there's no progress, when in fact there's a lot of sort of slow-moving progress that might not be quite perceptible to us, but to somebody who's really been engaged for decades, is very, very evident. So I was struck by that. The second thing I'll say, and I think we'll probably come back to, I was struck by how clear both of them were about the centrality of the U.S.-China bilateral relationship, and they touched on pretty much every major issue in the world, be it peace, economic development, climate change, global health, cybersecurity, energy, and the centrality of the U.S.-China relationship to that. About 20 years ago, it was evident that if you wanted to achieve anything important globally, Europe and the U.S. had to see eye to eye. That's no longer the case. It has to be U.S. And China shared understanding to move things forward. The last thing that struck me, and I don't know if this is something that we might want to come back to, is that this question of the relationship of single-party rule and market capitalism. And despite the fact that there is growing evidence that those two things can very well coexist, the questions keep coming back. Well, we couldn't have really envisioned Korea becoming democratic, so it just got to be around the corner. Carter, I think, resisted quite effectively to this, and and I think one of the biggest sort of questions for us is how do we move beyond our presumption that free markets and a free society have to go together. And for me, at a business school, the challenge of helping our students understand to what extent you can have a system that is very much dominated by markets, but a political system that interacts with those market forces in ways that are just completely different from anything that our students or the companies that they tend to work for are used to. So I was struck by that as well.
There's a question in the front.
Thank you for coming tonight. So during my 4 years living in China, there were two things that struck me. One was generally the lack of trust in society in many relationships, and a husband-wife, a employer, company, citizen, government. So across all different relationships. So that's one. And two, that there was always kind of this distinction between Chinese and everyone else, and that I don't know where that came from, but it was always kind of trying to distinguish that there's 1.3 billion Chinese, and then there's everyone else. Do you think that those two dynamics that are in play in China right now can continue if China wants to be a world power?
First of all, I'm a Chinese national. I don't feel I'm that kind of special, I guess. To some extent, we see a lot of American movies. I think American also make, you guys also look very special, all the superheroes. But having said that, I get you what you mean to say. I will say on the Chinese side, the state media does play a very important role in terms of sometimes strengthening, sometimes weakening the mutual trust, between U.S. and China for different purposes. And in more recent years, in particular after Xi Jinping came to the stage, I do feel pretty sad for our state media coverage on, whatever happens to U.S.-China relations in almost all aspects, as you just mentioned, commercial or political. We have, recently we have the sort of the antitrust campaign in mainland China, targeting a number of foreign companies, including some American enterprises. But some people say the antitrust campaign is just kind of an excuse that Beijing tried to, sort of launch a new round of attack to contain the expansion by U.S. companies. And when the news was reported in the state media, most Chinese people can only access state media. You understand there's a huge problem about freedom of the press in mainland China. So when they get the news from state media, they just feel like you guys, American corporates, do the wrong things, and I support my government. That kind of things are not very positive and hopeful to improve the relations.
So there's a question that's just come in from someone, Bill, in New Haven. Given his foundation's apparent financial support from China, shouldn't we consider him a paid lobbyist for the Chinese government and take some of his powder puff comments about today's China with a grain of salt? So I think the first thing we'll each say something about that. I don't think that his foundation is supported by China. He lists, if you open up the Carter Foundation, one could check. So I think the first thing that, Bill, if you're listening in or if you're watching, would be that I think we do need to verify that. None of the panelists thinks that's true. We don't have it in front of us right now to double check. So we would never, I don't think, I'll speak them for myself. I certainly don't consider President Carter a paid lobbyist for the Chinese government. I think I would also draw your attention to the piece by Orville Schell in last week's New York Review of Book, which gives a terrific analysis of Carter's visit to China, which he mentions, but he doesn't talk about the substance of that visit. And I think that would also lay to rest some of your concerns that he could be a lobbyist. I think the other thing, as I would just repeat what I said, what I came across was seeing a former president of the United States who was extraordinarily informed and had a long, long career of public service in the United States, which he has continued through till this moment. And so he is, to me, very far from a lobbyist. Would anyone else like to address this question?
I would also add that I think that his center and its activities in helping monitor village elections has actually drawn the fire of nationalists inside China. So seeing him as too much advocating the U.S. agenda, whether that's true or not, is another question, but I don't think that he is seen as being sort of in bed with the Chinese at all. Far from it.
In fact, the question that you asked
I
on Twitter that wasn't read out was, yes, maybe you want to repeat it here.
Well, the question that I posed is how would he respond to critics inside China who see the Carter Center and other NGOs as trying to weaken and westernize China, principally through this grassroots elections, but et cetera.
Right. So if anything, potentially the view being the opposite.
That's right. That's right.
So depending on where you sit.
So, Bill, I'm not sure if you're listening directly. That was Professor Jessica Weiss, who was speaking about the views in China of the Carter Center itself, which is quite the reverse of thinking them as a lobby speaking for China. On the contrast, the Carter Center and its support for elections is seen really as a force of change on the side of American democracy. Are there more questions coming from the audience, or people want to speak to this question about trust? I do think that was one of the things when I was listening. He kept coming back to this question about trust, and he was operating at stratospheric levels. And he was also talking that the world in which he's lived of, not only diplomatic nation to nation, but president to president issue, raises this question about how personalized diplomacy can be in a way that ordinary citizens never see. And it's only after you read the transcript or hear an interview that someone like me, who's focuses so much on structural constraints and dynamics, that the not fortuitous, I don't want to say that, but the power of individuals to seal a deal can really carry forward things at a geopolitical level. Whereas what your question was about trust, at the level as you experienced it on the ground. And I don't think this presentation today flew lower than 10,000 feet. I think we're up and we're dealing at diplomat to diplomat, nation to nation kind of conversation. I don't know if others felt that also.
What I'd add on the issue of trust, I can't really speak to trust within China or trust in the institutions, but I think if you look at the bilateral relationship, there are several questions about why is there so much mistrust, and why is there China bashing in the US, and why is there America bashing in China? And you can talk about the media and you can talk about opportunistic policymakers, but also the reality is, if you take a step back, those are the two dominant powers in the world at this point, right? The Europeans obviously have a lot of economic clout, but not the same political clout. And so if you look at who can really be a rival to the other when it comes to political or to economic influence in the world, it's China to the US and the US to China. So regardless of what anybody does or anybody says, quite structurally you have the ingredients for potential mistrust and misunderstandings, because both sides are keenly aware of their dependence on the other, of their potential vulnerability to the other. Which means that you have to work hard just to maintain a certain level of trust, let alone overcome some of those things. So I think some of that is inevitable. It's a reflection of the importance that each country has in the lives of the citizens in the other.
I think also I would add that there's a little bit of a concern that the Chinese dream or Xi Jinping's use of nationalism might be seen as a substitute for that kind of interpersonal trust, that if somehow you can unite society around sort of common mistrust or vigilance against an external enemy. I don't think that's yet set in stone, but there's a concern that it might head in that direction, and I'm hopeful that isn't being seen as the strategy. But it is a concern. I imagine there are some inside China who see that as potentially very useful nationalism as this kind of uniting force, as replacing what was otherwise maybe might be seen as a spiritual vacuum. Now we're also hearing, even in the last couple of days, the use of Confucianism and drawing on other traditions in China that might provide this kind of touchstone, sort of a cultural a thread of unity. Something that Chinese can be proud of that doesn't require rejecting the foreign, although there's a little bit of that too. So I think this is still evolving, but that's, if anything, that's the only connection I would see between those two elements.
If I could, I want to add some comments on Professor Davis's earlier comment about Deng Xiaoping and Carter's relationship. I think if we talk about trust, I think the president-to-president trust, the mutual trust between two persons are very critical for the whole nation. I don't get, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't get a feeling that the mutual trust between Xi Jinping and Obama could be as well as as good as Carter and Deng Xiaoping. At least from the press coverage or the information available here, I don't see the two gentlemen have sort of personal chemistry. Not yet, maybe. I mean, for a period of time, I think Jiang Zemin and Bill Clinton had sort of good chemistry, and then they can talk, more often, even through some hotlines. And the other thing we need to think about the U.S.-China relations in terms of mutual trust is we have to also put Russia in the context to some extent, I think. There are a lot of media coverage and analysis saying whether we are getting back or not getting back and, moving forward to the Cold War 2.0 era. And if that is the case, and then you need to ask yourself, whether Xi Jinping trusts Putin more or, Obama. That would be an interesting observation, if we put that angle in the context of the U.S.-China relations.
Historically, going back to just this question, George, and the others, is that I think Deng Xiaoping was at a point in his career and what he had lived for that he was going for broke and he was going for history. And I don't think Xi Jinping is in the same place.
It's a follow-up on Mr. Bach's remark about the inevitability to some extent of the rivalry, which sounds to me a very, very reasonable assertion, because what strikes me, I'm not American, and what strikes me when I hear American leaders talking about their relation to China is the incredible amount of sentimentalism, whether negative or positive in it, is very striking. I don't know if it's as true on the Chinese side. It might be, I don't know. But it's like it's not only about trust, it's not only about like having a positive relation, it's also they want to be liked so bad. And it's very surprising because, I mean, I'm too young to know that, but I don't think there was the same amount of feeling of like unrequited love during the Cold War with the Russians. So my question is, what's going on here? Is it like a special China-America thing that dates back, I don't know, to the missionary age? Or is it something the political culture of America today? So yeah, if you have an idea about it.
You made a reference to me, but
Yeah.
I think the people around me are better positioned to answer that question.
So indeed, I think what David talked about was the key role that EU and the Europe played in an earlier period, that this was this strong alliance, and this is now more complicated, and the relationship is definitely different. On the question of the centrality, Orlean said it, and people, whether it's in business or whether it's about pollution, these are the number one, number two economies, the number one, number two polluters. If we don't get it straight, the world will burn up. I mean, so there's an urgency about getting these two to agree. And then the issue about they want the language that's used. I think always, of course, as you know, the U.S. doesn't have a professional diplomatic corps, and our ambassadors, our top ambassadors, our political appointees, we don't come through and come up to international positions in the same way as you do in Europe. So this creates a very different face when the American ambassador from any country is speaking, right? He's from the winning party in the last election, and he is a major contributor, et cetera. So he is speaking, there are some women also, from their own interests, I think. And so it is more political. Sometimes it's an extension of the campaign trail, and it's a lot of other things, which I think that maybe we're the only country in the world, certainly we're the only big country in the world who puts that face on our top diplomats.
It's not all ambassadors, it's some. But
No, the
you're
top
absolutely
10.
Right.
The top 10.
That's right. So look, I mean, I'd say,
Including to China.
I want to be clear that rivalry doesn't mean adversity to me, and rivalry also doesn't mean that there can't be lots of shared interests. And so I'd pick up, Deborah, your point, and I don't know a whole lot about chemistry between individuals. For me, the key question is not whether President Xi and President Obama have chemistry. The question is, do they recognize their shared interests? Where do they have that interest? And that interest can lead to collaboration. That collaboration can lead to trust, and it can actually widen the areas where you can pursue projects of shared interest. But even though you're collaborating on projects of shared interest, there can be, some kind of rivalry on the other. To your point about wanting to be liked, I'm going a little bit out of my depth here, but it seems to me that China is certainly has an image of itself as a great civilization, and I think America likes to think of itself in much the same way. And it's not a totalitarian ideology that tries to be all-consuming, but it is certainly the kind of thing where you would say, well, how can anybody not be impressed by all of what we have achieved as a nation? Which, for those of us who are neither from China or the U.S., is a little bit, strange at times to watch. There's probably something there as well. But that perhaps is the part of the rivalry that can even be quite constructive, right? And trying to sort of impress people around the world with progress and achievement and commitment.
I want to say, in terms of the U.S.-China relationship, it is certainly a very special relationship, more special than anything else I can imagine of. When Xi Jinping came to power, one thing he mentioned is he wanted to build a new big nation relationship, 新型大国关系 for the U.S. and China. He did make some elaboration on that, but we haven't really seen what exactly the big nation relation is. But this is for the first time Xi Jinping, and the 新型大国关系 is only for U.S. China. Whenever he mentioned the 新型大国关系, the term, that's only for U.S. and China. He didn't mention that for Russia or for EU or other sovereignties. So that's one point. And the other thing is, back to your question about the on and off sort of the relationship, I pretty much agree with Professor Davis. I think except the ambassadors, I think we have to understand U.S. as a a political system. The society has much more higher level freedom of expression.
Yeah.
So you have very different system. The Congress, the senators, you can't control. These people, saying, I heard from my friends inside the foreign ministry. Sometimes they get confused. Sometimes Obama is trying to send a good signal, and then suddenly tomorrow, someone else, spoke of something very negatively, totally the other way around. And then for them, all these important people are American, officials or congressmen or whatever, just titles, but they are senior American. So that kind of confusion is always, grow even inside the foreign ministry. I understand.
I would say that this is true of, I think, China's relations with a lot of democracies. Obviously, there's only one sort of new type of great power relationship. But nonetheless, if you look at China's relations with India, with Japan, with Taiwan, and you see this kind of this tug, this push-pull, kind of love-hate, coexisting side by side as both sides recognize shared interests, but also have these competing interests, as well as fears of what China's economic and security rise mean to their national or perceived national interests. So I think that you see this, in the case of Xi Jinping's recent visit to India, where you had, on the one hand, huge economic deals on the table, at the same time you had a border standoff with troops, so at altitude. And so I think if you look, more broadly, you will see sort of elements of this in many of China's foreign relations.
And then I just return to where we started on my point that the relationship between Carter and Deng was in such a different point of history and relative balance or not balance. I should have emphasized, to me, one of the biggest differences for Deng and Carter, it was really diplomacy without very much, almost no economic actors. And what was today so obvious, and with the National Committee, is there's politics there, but if we talk about the web of interests and who wasn't in that conversation, but who is in the negotiations, it is the head of every corporate 500, it was Fortune 500, as well as on the Chinese side, all the heads of both private and state enterprises, which now have an autonomy in the Chinese political system, and they have their vested interests and they have their voice. And that is another way in which the conversations today have to be totally different. They're just a whole different range of participants, people, constraints. And listening to that was very much here. I felt that those voices were nipping, or not nipping, voices don't nip, but they were there, bubbling underneath this conversation.
Recently, can you hear me? Recently there was some news regarding President Obama and President Xi Jinping getting together, and he asked the president to treat Chinese people and himself as equal people with respect. And it seemed that President Obama did not respond to that. So I was wondering, I think, is there some kind of other powers controlling President Obama, I think, not to respond to equal status between the two nations?
I don't understand the question.
The question is that President Obama, I think, could not respond to treat Chinese people or President Xi Jinping on equal footing. And I was wondering, I think, if there are some vested interests which are controlling American policies, not to allow American president to treat others on equal footing.
In what way on equal footing?
Taking their views, I think, on the world negotiations like Iran and things like that. It seems that US's position is always trumping others' positions, others' point of views. So it's not equal footing, I think, in the world stage. US on one side and the rest of the world on the other side.
Maybe we can reframe the question into sort of, do you believe there's sort of American arrogance, being...
I think any foreign policy, there's always sovereign interests, whether you want to translate that into vested interests. And each country will speak for its number one concern. And we know in foreign policy, when a leader speaks, very often the key audience is the domestic audience. You have to read every single diplomatic exchange through the lens of the domestic audience. And for example, when I read the most hard-edged statements coming from China, which I perhaps would hope are not going to be as hard-edged, one thing I always do is turn it around and say, who does he need to talk to in China? What are the concerns he has that he has to address? And similarly in the United States. So we know that, as I think you were mentioning, George, we can have all kinds of, to me, very extreme statements made by congressmen in the United States about what China is doing or what the U.S. should be doing. And then I'm thinking, this person is running for re-election in South Carolina. And that's really what this is about. That's who he's talking to. It may seem he's talking about a foreign issue, but he is talking to his own electorate.
For the votes.
Always. I mean, that's democratic politics.
Sure.
But what Susan Shirk has shown very clearly, and Professor Weiss can speak to that because you know Professor Shirk's work so well, but when she came here to do the Hume Lecture, she was doing the book on public opinion in China. And so Shirk has shown, I think, definitively that we must read Chinese public statements and Chinese politicians as politicians who also need to deal with public opinion and their own domestic politics. And that means we're always reading and rereading what is said. So on these questions of vested interest trumping, it has to be seen in this multi-leveled audience.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would also say that I think that there's actually quite, as we heard from President Carter, quite a lot of respect for the difficulties that Chinese leaders face in their political sensitivities at home, which is in part sort of cautioning American leaders from saying things, condemning the Chinese leadership. I think to the extent that we have people, senators and others who feel sort of morally obligated, in fact, they are often championing the Chinese people, perhaps at the expense of the Chinese regime. And so in that sense, I think that there's a sense of universalism that actually often puts Americans at odds with the Chinese government. But this is, I think, fundamentally driven out of respect for the Chinese people rather than a sign of disrespect.
We have two questions from Harper. She's written in twice, so I think we should share that. The last one is, do you think that China and the U.S. have a balanced economic relationship?
I mean, balanced in the sense that, each side has benefited tremendously from the other. So, this is not if there's one economic relationship that you can point to, this is true for most economic relationships, but I think one where you can say, this is clearly not a zero-sum relationship. This is clearly an example where engagement, collaboration, and trade has created tremendous wealth on both sides of the U.S.-China economic relationships. So there are aspects of the relationship that are balanced. There's a trade deficit in one direction. There's flow of investment in the other direction, and so on. But overall, it's clearly a relationship that has benefited, a large number of people in both countries, even people who might respond to the kind of bashing that goes on at the same time, as you described. And it is a fact that some of those same voters you spoke about, who probably respond to Congress people blaming China for loss of jobs, have been enjoying, prices for finished goods that have been steady in real terms and in fact declining. And a big reason for that has been the incredible competitiveness boost a productivity boost that has resulted from China's entry into the world economy. People don't often perceive it that way, but it's clearly a fact. So, yes.
Is it okay? Perfect. So, Professor Davis, this question is not directed to you, but it's kind of stemming off a lot of the comments that you've made regarding history and the way that we look at China. So I've been because I'm a senior and I have a 4-day weekend every week. I have the luxury of watching a movie on YouTube, pirated from China, on various topics. And one of the ones that I've been focusing on is a movie based on late Ming Dynasty politics. From my observations of China, and this may be very naive of me, I see there are a lot of similarities with kind of Ming Dynasty politics and what's going on with China today in terms of the consolidation of power under one person at the expense of collective leadership, and a lot of let's say political purgings and of the like. So this is kind of the setup for the question. My question is that we mentioned during the talk that if China wants to be a world power or leading power, China needs to do whatever. And my question is our assumption that China wants to be a world power correct? Just from a historical perspective, China has always been known by itself as the Middle Kingdom, the center of the world. So does it necessarily care that it's a world power? Does China's projections of power in Africa, is that more of just a need for natural resources, or can it be interpreted as a kind of an expansion of power? Because I want to take a step back. When in the Ming Dynasty, there was an Admiral He, and he was able to put together a huge naval armada that traversed a lot of the world. And unlike Western powers, the Ming Dynasty emperor said, this mission is too expensive. I don't want to project the power. So I guess my question, I'm going to just tither it, is should we look at China from the perspective of the West? And if we can't, how should we look at China in terms of its policies?
Do you want to take that?
Okay, I'll take it, and then the experts can speak. China is a world power. So it's not a question of do they want to be a world power. I mean, it is. It's a member of the Security Council, has been for 35 years. It's the #1 economy I read today, not the #2, but it certainly will be #1 very soon if it's not this week.
By the end of the year.
By the end of the year, okay. So I think this is a global power, and if we want to go back to the Ming, we can talk about China was the biggest. I mean, in the pre-modern world, China was a global power. It had all the trappings of global power in a way that non-nation states in Europe didn't have, and of course North America had no nation states. So I'm not quite sure what the Ming Dynasty has to do with it, except to and emphasize that this is the longest continuous national bureaucracy in human history, and the period in which they were closed in a way from 52, let's say, until 80 was quite aberrant.
Yeah, I hear what you say. I think it's a very interesting topic to make a comparison between today's China and the Ming Dynasty. You probably know there's a book called 万历15年, the written by a historian, the insignificant year
Yes.
in the 万历 Dynasty. One thing is for sure, there's certainly a very clear similarity, which is about corruption. The corruption is like a huge problem for the Ming Dynasty. And I understand even inside of the government in the Ming Dynasty, there are also a lot of political struggles, which is exactly what is happening right now. In Beijing, inside Zhongnanhai, I believe so. Given the news we've already seen, about the Bo Xilai, Zhou Yongkang, etc. So that's one point. And I agree with Professor Davis. China is, people always try to say, the rise of China, the rise of China. It's not the rise of China, it's the revival of China. Back to the Tang Dynasty, China is already the leading power in the world. But is China going to be, or is Xi Jinping going to make China the world power? I have some reservation on that. In particular, when you see Xi Jinping recently try to promote the Confucius series, I hear you say, the 中国, like middle kingdom, you can understand it's, sort of literally meaning like the center of the world. But, 中, the Chinese character, also has a lot of Confucius meanings. It could be like, I can be just in middle of something, sort of a mediator role, but not like the word police or the word judge.
I would say also that in recent years, I think China has also wanted to downplay its global leadership role and considering itself still a developing power. And so I think currently and in years to come, how China sees and articulates the form of leadership it wants to play will tell us a lot about what it ends up wanting to do with that power, which it is clearly already amassing. But I don't think that sense has yet been articulated inside China.
David, did you want to speak?
Well, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. I mean, China has immense power and it's going to continue to accumulate power. And the question is, how is it going to use that power? And I think to your previous question, I think, there are a number of issues where certainly the U.S. government and people around the world would like to see China play a more constructive and more engaged leadership role around the world. So, public health being one, climate change being another one. Of course, when China then does exert its power, people in Washington and Brussels say, well, that's not exactly what we had in mind, slightly differently. So, you don't really get one without the other. But, I think it isn't really a question of whether it wants to, whether it is. And to your point about Africa as an example, you can look at this and look at, sort of an evil imperialist design or aspiration. You can say, well, you have natural resource needs that the government is trying to satisfy on behalf of its citizens and its companies, and whether there's a design behind it or just necessity is simply a reflection of the fact that it is a country that, whether it wants to or not, its actions have increasingly global ramifications. There used to be this saying that when the U.S. sneezes, the world catches a cold, and it was really a reference about economic relationships. And you can say much the same for China. In terms of the implications that developments in China have for economies and societies. around the world.
We don't have any more questions now in the queue, Abby, from the Gmail. So maybe we should see if there's any last question in the audience. If there's none in the audience and there are none online, then I think we would thank Abby Newman and Jessica Chin for helping us organizing it, and thank you all for coming.